Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use, tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay, you guys, this is from AILA. I believe this is some type of immigration blog. Recent child labor violations highlight need for critical labor reforms. Dated 8/24/23. Can't help but think of that help sign in the Scientology building in which the Los Angeles police officers, paid it no mind. Scientology handlers came out, told them everything was fine. Police walked away, didn't even do an investigation. It's all on film. On July 14th, 2023, Devon Thomas Perez, a 16-year-old boy from Guatemala, was killed while working a nighttime sanitation shift at Marjack, a poultry processing facility in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Devon's death comes after the death of two other 16-year-old boys working hazardous jobs this summer in the United States. On June 29th, Michael Schulz died while working at the Wisconsin sawmill, and on June 8th, Will Hampton died from injuries sustained working at a landfill. These three deaths occurred on the heels of massive investigative reporting efforts over the last several months from NBC, the New York Times, and 60 Minutes about children across the U.S. working in industries like protein processing. That's all those slaughterhouses, with high rates of injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. I've heard that so many times at those slaughterhouses they have children working. I've heard this so many times. Many of these stories focused on the immigration and familial status of these children, namely that they are unaccompanied minors. Unaccompanied minors. Where have we heard that before? From Central and South America. Shifting the blame away from employers. Of course. Instead, parents have been arrested and put into removal proceedings. Well, yeah, also, too, the parents are supposed to protect the children. And young adults who misrepresented their age to press and border officials have been met with vindictive hit pieces. It's always the same game, isn't it? Always the same game. Significant collateral consequences could ensue in their immigration cases, ruining not only their lives, but those of other children and young adults fleeing poverty and violence. Vulnerable come to mind, you guys? It's always the vulnerable. People feed off of them. But Schulz and Hampton were white U.S. citizen children. Their deaths illustrate that child labor violations are rampant and affect not only immigrant, indigenous, black, and brown communities. Thus, the recent media attention on child labor highlights the need for reform of both U.S. immigration laws and federal child labor laws. They need to put a clause in which it includes religious as well, somehow. That needs to happen. It feels like not much has changed since the Industrial Revolution, where labor activists like Mother Jones were first sounding the alarm around the exploitation of children's labor. Child labor law. The history of labor reforms in the United States at the turn of the 20th century was deeply connected to child labor or exploitation. During this time, child labor was commonplace, still is, and children often worked long shifts in incredibly dangerous conditions. Perhaps the most famous child workers were the breaker boys, young boys who worked in mines and separated coal from slate and impurities by hand. Didn't a lot of those children go blind? Children also worked in factories, as chimney sweeps, and as domestic servants. Sounds like Scientology. Some of the country's earliest labor laws were focused on regulating child labor, especially in hazardous industries. In 1842, Massachusetts passed the nation's first ever child labor law, prohibiting children under 12 years from working in factories. By 1850, every state in New England had followed Massachusetts' example, setting minimum legal working ages for children, varying from 9 to 14. In 1916, the Keating-Owen Act, the first federal law regulating child labor, passed. However, this law only regulated child labor used in certain businesses, factories, workshops, canneries, mines, and quarries, along with businesses that participated in interstate commerce. This meant that nearly 2 million more child workers in other types of businesses, most notably home-based businesses and farms, were not covered by the law. Far fewer than 10% of children were actually covered. The Keating-Owens Act was struck down by the Supreme Court 2 years later, and it was not until the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, in 1938 that federal child labor law would be upheld by the court. While the FLSA was a huge step forward in labor reform, establishing federal minimum wage and overtime requirements, among other things, the delineation of what work is and is not permissible for children remains confusing and unclear. Under the FLSA, there are 2 categories for child labor: agricultural and non-agricultural. For agricultural jobs, children as young as 10 are permitted to work if employers submit a request to the Secretary of Labor. Wow. Children under 12 can also work in agriculture with the consent of their parent or guardian, with no minimum wage requirement in place. Outside of agricultural jobs, the FLSA sets a minimum working age of 16 years old. However, the corresponding regulations to the FLSA allow for children as young as 14 to work in 15 categories of occupations, ranging from office and clerical work to lifeguarding, but only if you are 15, to cooking, so long as the cooking does not occur over an open flame. The list goes on. Thus, when trying to determine what jobs 14 and 15-year-olds can legally work, you are faced with a convoluted and unclear series of rules. The U.S. Department of Labor provides a young worker toolkit, but these materials are just as confusing as the laws. For example, a bookmark from the Young Worker Toolkit attempts to provide a succinct explanation of what non-agricultural jobs 14 and 15-year-old children can perform, stating, work in specific non-hazardous jobs in non-manufacturing industries under certain conditions. Sounds like a loophole to me. To ascertain what these non-hazardous jobs in non-manufacturing industries are, children and their families can look to the DOL's Youth Employment Guide, which states, you cannot work in any of the jobs prohibited by the hazardous occupation orders, or in most occupations involving transportation, construction, warehousing, communications, and public utilities. You cannot work in processing, mining, in any workroom or workplace where goods are manufactured or processed, in freezers or in meat coolers. You cannot operate or tend any power-driven machinery except office machines. You cannot perform any baking operations, like SP Chef did. You cannot perform youth peddling, sign waving, or door-to-door sales activities. That reminds me of Children of God cult and many others. You cannot work from ladders, scaffolds, or the substitutes. This language is hardly accessible for 14 and 15-year-olds, let alone unaccompanied minors and those with limited literacy, even if translated to Spanish and other languages. Well, that's the parents' job. You guys catching this one? Recourse for child labor violations, if there are any. While the 3 16-year-olds who tragically lost their lives, because you know it's only 3, right? You guys know there's more. This summer were prohibited from doing the specific types of jobs they were doing. They were not prohibited. Oh, here we go, you guys. Here we go. They were not prohibited from working in these hazardous industries. Really? Huh? What kind of world are we living in? In this sense, the DOL guidance can be misleading. While DOL's Youth Employment Guide implies that 16-year-olds like Devon are generally not allowed to work in the meat processing industry, when looking at the regulations, there is no clear prohibition of individuals under 18. Rather, there are 7 categories of jobs. Children ages 16 and 17 are prohibited from doing in meat processing facilities, including the job Devon was doing on the night of his death. Can they expound on what he was doing? Is it a mystery? Oh, I see. Cleaning equipment. Instead of listing out exceptions, child labor regulations should flat out prohibit children under 18 from working in these industries. Facts. Until then, children, families, and employers will remain confused about what jobs these children can and cannot do. And in turn, our nation's children, regardless of status, will continue to get injured and killed. All in the name of greed, you guys. Thankfully, there is some recourse for child labor violations. Really, I want to see this. These violations can be reported to the Wage and Hour Division. Yeah, if they're under the guise of work. But if they're in a so-called church or a cult, the Wage and Hour Division doesn't do anything. In fact, nobody does anything. So, I mean, where to begin? Which can then assess back wages owed to minors and civil money penalties against companies violating child labor laws. For immigrant workers and children, there are some limited immigration protections. Isn't that great that they're limited, you guys? Labor agencies can provide U visa certifications for victims of certain crimes that occur in the workplace, so long as there is an underlying law that the agency enforces that was also violated, and the worker cooperates in the investigation. You guys see what they're doing? If somebody, like a young person, is working and they came from another country, they're not going to fight back. You guys know it, and so do I. It's all fluff words. Additionally, workers, including children, who are victims of trafficking, here we go, may be able to obtain a T visa. They limit them, by the way, just so everyone knows. They don't like to give those T visas out. With the labor agencies providing a T visa certification. You see, it all looks good in print, doesn't it? Additionally, in January 2023, the Department of Homeland Security announced a streamlined process for immigrant workers to obtain labor-based deferred action, a temporary status for immigrant workers involved in a local, state, or federal labor investigation or dispute. You know what it doesn't say? It doesn't include churches, does it? Deferred action protects immigrant workers from retaliation in the form of immigration enforcement. That's what I was just talking about. And provides them with a work permit, thereby enabling them to enjoy the full range of whistleblower protections, including reinstatement into a job, back pay, and forward pay. Immigration practitioners who come into contact with immigrant workers and children should screen for these forms of relief. Intertwined labor and immigration movements. The FLSA is now 85 years old. At the time of its passing, members of Congress from the Jim Crow South ensured that jobs were black, brown, and immigrant workers were exempt from its protections. To this day, farm workers are exempt from overtime requirements. The child labor exceptions have resulted in poor children, immigrant children, and children of color being exploited in these industries as well. Thus, labor advocates pushing for change to the FLSA, including removing overtime exemptions, must also push for these necessary child labor reforms. And immigrant advocates pushing for changes in our country's immigration laws, particularly for unaccompanied minors, should join in the labor fight as well. It's by Shelley Anand and Audrey Moore. I will leave a link in the description box. Like and subscribe if you choose. Otherwise, have an amazing day or night wherever you are. Peace.